thanks for deciding to join me on Spotlight on Spirit. You're Connie Hollister. I've known you for a few decades. What a privilege it's been. You're going to paint a picture of what it looks like to be a part of No One Dies Alone, and we might
Hmm.
venture off into other territories too, because your vocation is a nurse. And
That's
so
correct.
we will just see where this takes us. So No One
Sure.
Dies Alone. It's a
Yes.
it's a national organization. It's a nonprofit.
I'm not
Um,
really sure exactly.
yeah.
Maybe you know that. I became involved with it when I decided to be a volunteer after I retired
Hmm.
from being a full time nurse at Mayo for 45 years.
Yeah.
And so, as I signed up to be a volunteer, they ask you for what options or things you would be interested in volunteering in. And
Oh,
I looked at being, and I am part of what's called the Nurse Honor Guard, which we can talk a little bit about that too if you
yes.
choose to. And then the other piece that I had heard about prior to retiring and always was interested in was the No One Dies Alone program at Mayo Clinic.
Thank you for reminding me about the honor guard because they both do something very specific, but it really is the honoring of individuals that
I
both
think
of
so.
them do.
Right.
And the fabric of who we are as human beings is always intricately tied to our spiritual values
Hmm.
of honoring and serving one another. And both of them fulfill that.
They certainly do for me. And I think I've
Yeah.
appreciated for my own scheduling and things, just as a little promo for both of those options, they are always an option. These aren't
Mhm.
something like I'm scheduled in once a week.
Okay.
And what happens with the No One, specifically back with the No One Dies Alone or either one, the volunteer office at Mayo Clinic will send out a text to us that
Hmm.
have signed up as volunteers for these specific options. Like I just received one for a No One Dies Alone, and what it comes out is as a vigil. And it just
Okay.
comes out as a text to us, and then we sign in to our dashboard under the volunteer
Sure.
system at Mayo, and then we find out the specifics.
Connie, is the No One Dies Alone for Mayo only for those that have worked at Mayo, or do you find other people are part of that?
No one, now are you talking about people that volunteer to do it or the patients that we serve?
Yeah, like it sounded like when you were offloading, if you will, from Mayo
Hmm.
Clinic as a staff member, they had what? How would you like to stay connected with Mayo Clinic? Because we value you, and they give you options. So if
Well,
someone
it's
who's never worked at Mayo wants to be a part of it,
Well, it's. I'm going to clarify that just a bit because
okay.
what I did was once I retired from Mayo Clinic,
Hmm.
I then accessed and asked to go through the volunteer training program, totally separate
Oh,
from being an employee.
sure.
So
Okay.
anyone, typically, I think the Nurse Honor Guard, we can talk a little more about that, would
Yep.
would more appropriately be for someone who had been employed at or yeah, employed either has been or is currently employed at Mayo Clinic as a nurse. The
Okay.
No One Dies Alone does not need to be a previous Mayo employee. It could
Okay.
be anyone. There is a training program through the volunteer office. It's all online. With the No One Dies Alone and the Nurse Honor Guard, we do have a brief in person orientation. And for the No
Mm,
One Dies Alone, they do request that we shadow another volunteer for at least one vigil.
okay. Okay.
Um, so the No One
Would,
Dies Alone could be anyone. If they were
okay.
interested in volunteering at Mayo and thought that was interesting. And just to explain a little bit about what that actually
Hmm.
is,
Yeah.
um, it's a program that Mayo has offered that allows for patients who may not be able to have, or family is not able to, or friends aren't able to be with them in
Mm,
possibly their last hours of their physical life.
yeah.
And so, if this can be initiated by staff, it could be initiated by family. It's most likely by staff, either the doctors, the nursing staff, palliative care. any of
Mhm.
those options can contact the volunteer office at Mayo Clinic and say, this is the patient's situation. They are
Mhm.
terminal. We are requesting volunteers to sit with this patient in the No One Dies Alone program. And
Okay.
what that means then is that there are time slots set up on our what we call the dashboard, the volunteer dashboard. Each
Mhm.
person has one, and I will go into that and I can see what volunteer options I've requested, and then there are shifts listed there, and we can sign up for shifts.
Okay.
And so the shifts are either for usually from 1 hour. They typically, it's been recommended that we not do longer than a 4 hour
Okay.
shift. For myself, I'm very comfortable doing this.
Mhm.
And so I said, it's probably good that I have a guideline of no more than 4 hours because I can just
Mhm.
sit there and be with this person
Mhm.
and be in that space. Typically, the person is very much resting comfortably,
Mhm.
um, sleeping or appears to be sleeping with not much, if any, interactive
Mhm.
or vocalization, anything like that.
Yeah.
But what is, it's been such an interesting process for me. One, I'm really comfortable sitting in that space. I
Mhm.
do consider it kind of a sacred space, and I'll maybe
Mhm.
speak to that a little more in a bit.
Yeah.
But the thing is, to be with a person at that point of leaving kind of the physical shell, if you will,
Yeah.
what,
Yep.
and that becomes very apparent in sitting with these folks.
Mhm.
And I've really appreciated different staff that have come in to interact, whether it's physicians, palliative care. Palliative care has music therapists that come in and will sing with these folks.
Mhm.
People try to be aware of people, like if the client or patient appreciated certain kinds of music, we will often have that playing on
Mhm.
the TV quietly or whatever. But I've really been impressed with what different people who come in to see the patient will say to them. And it's things like, know that you're safe, know you're
Mhm.
not alone, you are being taken care of. If you choose to leave or rest, you know,
Mhm.
finally, it's okay to do that. But
Yeah.
we are here with you. And
Yeah.
I've been impressed with the staff and how caring they are. Now, what was interesting to me, several things.
Mhm.
I had the privilege in one of, in fact, the last one I think I went with,
Uh-huh.
went to. I walked in the room and the chaplain was there, and so was three nursing staff and a physician. And the
Mhm.
chaplain actually said to me, she may be in the process of actually dying right now.
Mhm.
And I said to the chaplain, I said, well, I'm okay with being here if it's all right if I just sit with you all. And the chaplain said some wonderful things to this person, and she did pass. But I got such a high compliment from this chaplain in that she turned to me as we were concluding things, and she said, "You just have a really sweet spirit. You have a very
Mhm.
comfortable spirit." And I thought it was so nice to hear that that was evident, and it wasn't just something,
Mhm.
I felt
Mhm.
comfortable. The other thing that has struck me and that I've talked with some of the palliative care people about is that leaving this physical shell, if you will, is hard
Mhm.
work.
Mhm.
It's hard work. And
Mhm.
people say, well, what do you mean by that? And I said, not that people look like they're so actively struggling, you know, but
Mhm.
it's kind of like, I think, an animal shedding its skin in
Mhm.
some ways. And, that's not a totally without effort process.
Right.
And that's kind of the sense I've gotten sitting with these people.
Mhm.
And that, typically, I've been with a person within their last 24, 36 hours of being here physically. Um,
Yeah.
Previously, when I was on staff nursing in different settings, I had very much a sense when I felt people's soul or spirit had left.
Yeah.
And I could very comfortably say to family members, what you are encountering and interacting with right now
Mhm.
is more of a physical shell. Because I think
Yeah.
sometimes it's distressing for family if they do see some
Mhm.
breathing changes, those kind of things.
Yeah.
And when I would say that to family members, I really felt that they could see that more clearly and were okay with that. Even
Yeah.
though, yes, maybe they were grieving, but I think it offered them some message or measure of comfort. I want to back up if I can. Kelly, is that
Yep.
okay? If you
Yep.
need to guide me, please do. Because another thing, and I just mentioned it here, is about these sacred spaces.
Yep.
And I worked, maybe I mentioned it already, it's 45 years as a nurse at Mayo Clinic in 7 different areas. The longest times or areas I was in was inpatient addictions and then in our pain clinic for
Mhm.
about 22 years, I decided. Early on in my career, um, I had kind of an interesting experience. And first, it was it was distressing to me, and then I really came to understand what it was about. And that was that I had been with some patients who had been really critically ill, really, bordering
Mhm.
on possibly not living, and had stood in those spaces with them and their families, and they recovered. And what was interesting to me is encountered, I can specifically remember one person, I casually encountered this person out, like on the street. And what was interesting to me is they barely acknowledged me.
Mhm.
And I thought, what? What? Was there something
Right.
offensive? I stepped back and I've said this to other nurses since then. I said, I think we stand in such close proximity to those traumatic events that when a person moves through that, at
Mhm.
times they don't want to even brush against that again or somebody reminding them
Right.
of that.
Yep.
And so I learned to really regard that and
Yeah.
respect that. But it
Yeah.
was, like I said, as a new nurse, it was a little startling. But
Yeah. I'm sorry, but
go
entering
ahead.
into people's vulnerability when you're being vulnerable of your own, you find yourself in a traumatic experience. Yeah. And then how do you interact with others beyond that? There's that compassion that wants us to continue to connect.
Right.
Yeah.
But
That's what I hear.
the person who's experienced or been in that trauma,
Yeah.
like I said, may not either choose to or able to.
Yeah.
And like you've said, when you've been with those people in such vulnerable positions, um, and I have also, and
Hmm.
I think anybody, people probably who are a lot wiser than me have figured this out a long time ago. But um, we ask people how they're doing, right?
Hmm.
And sometimes we can tell people are pretty fragile when we're asking them to do that, especially
Hmm.
whether it's at work or whatever. Well,
Yeah.
what I started to realize after a while, if somebody says, I'm I'm okay or whatever, that I've learned to respect that and
Hmm.
give them that space because people often are just getting by. They want to use whatever environment they're in, maybe as distraction or using their energies just to get through it. So I've tried to leave people with that if you choose to or if need a safe place or whatever, know that I'm available.
Yeah. There's something about at the end of life, you know that you can't solve anything.
Hmm.
You're there to be with another human being in this transformation.
Hmm.
And it's also what I realized, and you might have connected on this level, is human beings, we can ignore who we are spiritually our whole entire lives. We don't
Hmm.
have to develop our soul, if you will, or our spirit. It gets to be a part of the package of our bodies. And we can pay more attention to the cognitive function and the physicality of who we are as human beings. But at end of life, you come face to face with who you are as a spiritual being because you just talked about just being with. There's words might not have the same effect,
Hmm.
but they also are part of. So when we're speaking at end of life, we're usually speaking from our souls.
Hmm. Right.
Being with, you're safe. It's okay.
I do have a reading, if you'd let me share it.
Yes.
It was written by Alan. D. Wolfelt, PhD of the Center for Loss and Transition in Fort Collins,
Mm-hmm.
Colorado. It's called companioning.
Okay.
Companioning is about honoring the spirit. It is not about focusing the intellect. Companioning is about curiosity. It is not about expertise. Companioning is about walking alongside. It is not about frantic leading or being led.
Mm-hmm.
Companioning is about being still. It is not about frantic movement with talk. Companioning is about discovering the gifts of the sacred silence. It is not about filling every painful moment with talk. Companioning is about listening with the heart. It is not about analyzing with the head.
Yeah.
Companioning is about bearing witness to the struggles of others. It is not about judging or directing those struggles.
Mm-hmm.
Companioning is about being present to another person's pain. It is not about taking away or relieving the pain. Companioning is about respecting disorder and confusion. It is not about imposing order or logic. Companioning is about going into the wilderness of the soul with another human being. It is not about thinking you are responsible for finding the way out.
Thank you.
I just, that's something that we keep in our No One Dies Alone. We have kind of a kit we take up with us to the
Oh.
room, and that's something we have in there. So I made copies of it. It was interesting. One of the people I was with was not on the palliative care unit, they were on a
Mm-hmm.
surgical unit. And I gave that to several of the nurses and staff working with this patient because their response was, we don't exactly know what to do for him
Right.
because
Which
we're,
is so uncomfortable, right?
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
right. And so I offered that to them. They said it was very, very helpful.
Yeah.
Um, Watching the nursing staff on the palliative care unit tenderly care for these folks and
Mm-hmm.
the things that they know to do were just really interesting to me. Um, Another thing I think I mentioned to you when we had coffee was about, again, encouraging a nurse that had been new to the profession at one point who was getting very already burned out, saying, I see these same people coming back with these same chronic medical things, and
Yeah.
I just don't know. And dealing with physicians or young physicians who maybe weren't listening to the nursing, all that. And I encouraged her to watch for what I call sacred spaces
Yeah.
and sacred points in time. And I think for me, in 45 years of nursing, that probably, and I don't mean to sound like, thinking back in my career, I don't think I was a superstar nurse. And I don't mean that in any way to negate myself. I just didn't do big projects, blah, blah, blah. Um, but I did come to understand the importance of those moments. Now, and I often
Mm-hmm.
said to people, sometimes that's seeing if somebody wants a glass of water
Mm-hmm.
or where the restroom is, or do they need a minute before you go on to talk about something difficult, or
Right.
checking with them if they're understanding the language,
Oh,
you know, because we in medical fields or any field, we can use all our language and we think, yeah, everybody should know what we're talking about.
yep.
Um, or sometimes for me, working especially in the pain and in the addictions area too, I used a good amount of humor.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I did that is because most of those folks, especially in the pain clinic, had come to be defined as either their diagnosis or their
Yep.
pain.
Yep.
And to use some humor, and I would often say to them, I do not do this unless I feel you could do it with me. That would be cruel.
Yeah.
Um, it for me, it and for them, it let them realize that they were still a person in there.
Yep. Who gets your
Um,
attention?
Yeah, and the other thing I often did is I didn't use the typical pain scale.
What did you use?
Well, some people said I should have maybe looked at getting it published. I think we can use this in so
Mhm.
many different situations. Here's what I use. 0 is no pain. Now that could be any kind of pain. 10 is pain that keeps you from doing what you would choose to do. how you would choose to do it, how long you would choose to do it, or if you do it. Now that changes people's pain ratings tremendously
Mm,
because
mm.
most people think of 10 as being pain like having your arm cut off or it's not the worst pain, whatever, you're passing
Yep.
out.
Yeah.
But if I started to give them that kind of scale, especially
Hmm.
family members would start to say, oh, then you're an 8 or a 9 all the time.
Yeah.
And I think it gave all of us a more realistic perspective on what we could possibly help someone move with.
Yeah.
And I think that can serve with any types of distress.
Hmm.
Um, and that was something I felt was valuable in my work in the pain clinic because people came in there and they wanted their pain gone.
Yesterday.
Yep.
Yep.
And to reframe that, and I think in most kinds of life distress, myself included, I want a pill, I want a prescription, I want a diagnosis, I want
Hmm.
whatever, and then let's come up with a
Yep.
treatment plan and get on with it.
Yeah.
And to reframe that as a process of how can we move that to where I can function more fully, maybe even with some level of pain or distress or whatever. How can I have
Right.
strategies or things that can move me more along that continuum?
That's helpful because it's a little realistic, because sometimes removing all pain is not realistic.
No.
So if you have all your hope and energy out there into this unrealistic expectation, it sets you up for disappointment, doesn't it?
Well, that's it. And the other thing is, it's pretty unrealistic for your expectations for providers, but
Yeah.
also for patient or for any of us to engage in the process.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
with a lot of the work you've done over the years and things like that, I think for myself, I think that kind of scale can translate into grieving, into
Yeah.
loss, into emotional pain, terminal chronic illness.
Yep. Yeah. It's like, is the Western medicine model a savior model, or is it a companioning model? What are we working with? What can we do? I have a certain skill set and some education, or a lot of education, to walk alongside you to
Hmm.
have a better quality of life,
Right.
is what I
That's
hear
right.
you saying.
Well, and I
Yeah.
also got the opportunity to work for 3 years in our pain rehabilitation center, which is and also in the pain clinic, actually in the addictions, I guess about any place. What the other thing I heard from people when I would be dealing with the pain clinic, I dealt with implantable stimulators to help with different types of
Oh,
pain and pumps. And people were like, "Is this really going to help?"
yeah.
And or is this going to whatever? And the pain rehabilitation center, that's a 15-day outpatient program that
Hmm.
they go every day from 8 to 4:30, and people are like, I don't know that I'm going to either make it through this, or I don't know that it's going to help, or you're trying to just screw with my brain or whatever.
Yeah.
And I would often say to folks, I have a different perspective. I can see the end to this. I can
Hmm.
see where the possibilities are.
Yeah. The
So I will
experience.
and there's no reason for you to trust it
Hmm.
right now, or trust me. You don't know me.
Yeah.
So I will hold the hope for you. I will carry the
Hmm.
hope.
This is
And
why I
again,
wanted you on the podcast. So
oh,
thank you.
bless your heart.
Yes. Pulling the curtain back behind some of the medical programs or events or occurrences or experiences or education, that brings in that the spirituality, I'm here with you, um,
And
helps your
really, at the
brain chill
yeah,
out.
really, end of the day, that's all we got.
That's all we got. One of the things that I realized with people that were dying is, if they had the opportunity to experience the decline, because not all of us are afforded that opportunity. Some
Hmm.
of us die quite quickly. But if you've been living with a chronic illness and it's been slowly, slowly, slowly going down as far as your ability, or you're stepped down quick, 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 um, you're quite well aware of where you are, but you
Hmm.
might not share it with others. So
Hmm.
sometimes such someone with, you wanting to sit with other, you're helping the family members that are not even in this, they're not in the same space.
Hmm.
They
Hmm.
haven't lived with the step down or the slow slide, if you will. But then there's the individual who can still sense your presence.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so there's really two things that the No One Dies Alone program accomplishes to a large degree, fulfilling the human need to not be alone during times of vulnerability and transition. And then to alleviate the fear and anxiety that family members probably have for not being able to be
Hmm.
there,
Right.
knowing that their loved one is cared for. So we're nourishing this sense of companioning. And so
Right.
it's a beautiful program. Can we switch over to your honor guard, the nurses honor
Sure.
guard? Because I'm completely unaware of that.
Okay. So the Nurse Honor Guard was actually initiated by a good friend of mine, Connie Ludke, and
Hmm.
she was the manager at the Pain and Rehabilitation Center for a number of years, and has a wonderful investment and interest in the history of nursing.
Uh-huh.
So she actually, in her possession, has at least two um, nurses' capes, the wool capes that nurses used to
Hmm.
wear. She
Oh.
actually has those herself. She has a lot of other nursing kind of artifacts she's collected. She got a grant through Mayo Clinic to actually have 6 replicas of those capes made
Hmm.
with the intention of this. If a person has worked at Mayo at any time in their lifetime, if they pass away within 100 miles of Rochester, their family, the funeral director, the pastor, anyone can call or contact the Mayo Volunteer Office and request a nurse honor guard to come and be present for whatever part of the
Oh,
visitation and service they would want us to be.
standing guard.
And so we often go, and I've gone with one other person. We kind of put out a text of this is, and it comes out
Mhm.
again as a text and an email from the volunteer office for us when the visitation will be, when the funeral will be. If you can be available, sign up on our dashboard. We also have a text that goes amongst us.
Mm.
So, because we have 6 capes, we could have up to 6 people. I don't know if we've ever
Okay.
had that many, but we've had 4.
Sure.
So we will go and we will have these capes on, and
Mm.
they're navy blue with a bright red lining. I have a picture in my phone. I don't know how I could, show that or whatever, and it wouldn't matter on a podcast. But so we wear those, and we
Uh-huh.
go and we will stand vigil during the visitation by an urn, by a coffin, by whatever is there, and
Uh-huh.
do that during the visitation, and then proceed into the service, either usually behind the officiant or priest or whoever, and then sit somewhere in the front row. And we have a reading we go through that actually says or describes how that person who's died represented the 7 roles of a Mayo Clinic nurse. And
Oh.
there's like vigilant guardian, teacher, navigator, and we fill
Hmm.
that in. And if we have other additional information, we will also, offer that of how they fulfilled that role, how long maybe they worked at Mayo. And when we are done, and we come up as the honor guard and we stand then facing the congregation while we do that, and one person reads it. And then we have a copy of that that we give to the family.
That's beautiful. Honoring that part of the person, their
Hmm.
vocation, how they evidence their purpose in this world, and then the brother and sisterhood,
Yeah.
that community, family. That's beautiful. And as you know, the military does that
Right.
very well too.
Right. So we keep trying to get the word out. I know Connie Ludke is good about. She actually. It sounds. I don't mean it to sound morbid, but she watches the obituaries because a lot of people
Mhm.
don't know about it, and
Many
she
people don't.
will actually initiate then the contact with family or with the funeral directors and say we're available. Just contact us. Let us know when and where. Um, I recently was privileged to go to one here close in Rochester. The person was 100 years old. She had
Oh.
worked at Mayo for 35 years.
Uh-huh.
Um, and it was a very, very small gathering.
Uh-huh.
But the priest who was there was so appreciative of what we said as well.
Yeah.
Um, so it's been very much, I use the word privilege a lot when I talk about my career. I
Yeah.
said it at my retirement party. I've said it in I don't know how many of my appraisals at
Mm-hmm.
Mayo about that it continues to be my privilege.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean to say, Kelly, as you well know, that every moment was all sunshine and roses. There were
Right.
some pretty tough times.
Yeah.
Um, and very frankly, at this point in my retirement, looking back at it, it does almost seem like a different lifetime in
Hmm.
some ways. And I'm kind of interested when I get talking a bit more medical with someone or about a condition or something they talk to me about, it's like a part of my computer files or something kind of open up that aren't necessarily open all the time anymore. And I'm very, very pleasantly surprised. People say, "Do you miss it?" And I say, "I really don't. I
Yeah.
don't feel a loss that way." And people say, "Well, you miss the people." I see the people I want to see. And it also has given me the opportunity to reconnect with dear friends
Right.
like yourself.
Yeah.
Um, and to get the validation that me as a person, what I value with someone like yourself and interacting has remained constant over time,
Yeah.
that I haven't so altered or whatever.
Yeah.
Like you've said, you said when we interacted, we kind of picked up
Right
where
where
we'd
we
been.
left off, there was a beat missed. It was beautiful.
And that's, I think, I worked, there's little things people remember about you. You probably found that too, right? And,
Mm.
we talked about working with people in trauma and things. Um, but also just what people remember, what really meant something. I
Mm.
worked for 3 years in the locked adolescent chemical dependency unit at Mayo. Yeah, that's that's exactly the energy, the interesting things I found out. One young woman came up to me a number of years later, and she said, "Do you know what I remember about you?" And I was like, "Oh dear," because I kept very clear boundaries. I
Yeah.
was the one that said everybody in the room at 10 o'clock, it's bedtime.
Yeah.
And I was like, "Oh dear." She said, "No, what I remember about you is you would play spoons with us on Saturday night."
Hmm.
A lot of these kids had never played games,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And it was also a way of seeing kind of how mentally they were clearing from chemical use. But it was such a precious thing that's what she remembered.
Mm.
When you talk about looking to somebody's soul, touching that.
What gets your attention? Can the mechanics of the physical and the cognitive experience, like they're in pain or they need you, grab your attention? Or can you look them and remember that they're a person experiencing pain and needing you?
Mm-hmm.
Because how you, what gets your attention will frame that interaction.
Right.
And so both of the honor guard and the no one dies alone is ensuring that the person is seen first and foremost. To me,
Mm-hmm.
nursing is a spiritual endeavor because you're always having to reassess your place in it and what can you do and what are your limits, and then how do you respond to suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And
And
yeah.
don't you think in our technical world, I mean, I never was an ICU nurse. I floated there
Mm.
one time and I found myself in the back bathroom in a panic attack because
Yeah.
I'm not good with all that technology and all the things that I have to keep track of and whatever. And I think it's challenging for nursing because you can definitely a nurse could get lost in making sure. Well, you have to, in those settings, there's
Yeah.
complex things going on all the time, and there wasn't.
Always.
I mean, there wasn't. constantly what I did in the pain clinic, but these patients who had these implanted pain pumps, the concentration of medication in those, if we got that in the wrong spot, that's like an immediate trip to the ICU.
Right.
So, there was a certain level of challenge and difficulty. You wanted to make sure you did it
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And I felt good that up till when I retired, I was capable of doing those things.
Hmm.
But I kind of started to find myself more and more that I just didn't want to.
Right.
And I think that's why I enjoy and why I appreciate what I do as a volunteer now, because it lets me do more of, I think, what resonates and what um, is truer to what I have to
Sure.
offer, maybe.
Yeah. The honor guard sounds like it's a Mayo specific.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
And it sounds like the No One Dies Alone for you is within the Mayo sphere. Mayo is in Arizona, Florida, I think Abu Dhabi, London, England, and then the Mayo Clinic Health System.
Right.
So the No One Dies Alone, it sounds like could be a part of these different places. Abu Dhabi might be questionable depending upon their focus, as well as England.
Well, and it depends on, I think, each individual site's kind of volunteer
Yeah,
services.
that's
I
what I'm
don't I
thinking.
don't really have a reference point for the other sites and what their volunteer service, because I kind of get the sense, and I may be wrong, that each site would have their own freestanding kind of volunteer
Yeah,
services department,
yes. And then the honor guard, the nurses honor guard is really a Mayo Clinic
and specific
focused.
and specifically
Mhm.
Rochester.
Specifically Rochester. And
Right.
it might spread because honoring those that we serve, if you will, because
Right.
the medical world is still a service
Right.
vocation.
I think it would be interesting because Connie Ludke personally kind of spearheaded this,
Uh-huh.
and I think it's being I don't want to say institutionalized, but um, kind of cemented into being ongoing, irregardless of her involvement
Sure.
at some
Yeah.
point. But again, it was specifically an individual launching that effort.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think it would be wonderful if it was taken, and other places may have something like
Right.
that I'm not familiar
Yeah.
with.
Yeah. In the military world, being able to recognize the legacy of those that have died on behalf of their country before you, that's really
Right.
what the honor guard is for, is, and then
Right.
to honor you. It's serving the position, which is usually a traumatic experience
Mm,
too, or a challenging role,
right.
roles that we as humans do to come alongside another's pain, trauma, experiences. And in the medical world, there's, then you have to, you touched on boundaries. You
Hmm.
have to know
Oh
what
yeah.
your place is within that sphere too,
Right.
and to maintain that, because somebody might need something from you and you can't spill over into your issues. So those boundaries serve to protect. They're not there to mourn, they're there to pay tribute and to
Right.
pay honor. Yeah. I thank you for your time.
You're so welcome. I,
Do you have any parting words that you would like to share with those? And our audience is really American Legionnaires,
right.
the auxiliary, but it's on YouTube as well as on Spotify. So we will find people that are not connected at all
Right.
with the military or American Legion listening in.
Well, I think
Nurse
my
Connie.
final words are two things. One, I think anytime we get a chance to walk alongside someone, and that I have found
Mm,
actually is all I can offer most people
yeah.
when they're struggling with something. They will usually figure out their own options, their own solutions, whatever. They're not asking for me to figure it out.
No.
And what I can legitimately offer is
Mm,
that or I'll even just stand with you in this spot as you need me
mm,
to. So I would offer that to people to think about that you don't have
okay.
to fix it. Just see if you're willing to stand. And also just to be aware of the privilege of standing in that sacred space with someone.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this privilege.
You're welcome.
See you soon, I hope.
Yes, ma'am.